So thanks for coming to the talk. My name's Teresa Dietrich, and I'm the Chief Product Officer at Stack Overflow. I've been in tech for 25 years now, which makes me feel a little old some days. I feel all of those 25 years. I actually started at AOL originally, and I actually lived in London in 2005 and 2006 working for AOL back in the day. So it's nice to be back after an extended absence here in London. Stack Overflow, hopefully you've probably heard of it if you work in the technology space, right? Maybe why you even decided to come here. So you probably know stackoverflow.com, and you may even know some of our technical Stack Exchange sites. We're used by folks all over the world, and we're almost 14 years old now. So we've been around for a long time. And we see about 100 million people coming on a monthly basis. And you can see what the 81% visit us weekly. That's a really interesting stat. People come back over and over again. And to reuse our knowledge, which is what we're going to be here to talk about, is about reusing knowledge. But thought we'd share some fun stats about Stack Overflow, and you know of it, but maybe you don't know all the details. Okay, so what we found over the years is that technology teams have very similar core universal challenges, right? First of all, how do we onboard people? Not just new folks, but even folks onto new technologies, new platforms, new services. How do we get them ramped up and capable? Secondly, how do we solve the big technology problems? It has a lot of complexity, that requires a lot of teams and a lot of knowledge and a lot of information to come up with a solution. And last but not least, working in a distributed team environment. We all know that's changed. So that can mean everything from a fully remote team, a distributor across multiple offices, or a hybrid team. So lots of new configurations that we're all dealing with, that we're trying to figure out how to handle this challenge. So when you try and come up with a product metric North Star, it's really hard. Just like anything in product, everybody has opinions, everybody has a point of view, and trying to figure out how you determine what your North Star metric is and how you really deliver value to your users is a lot more thought and a lot less calculation than you might think. And so when we look at organizations and how organizations scale, taking the internet and all of the technologists in the world as our sort of sample set that we started with, we figured out how do we create efficiencies, right? And I think as engineers, we love efficiency. That's a lot of why engineers and technologists do what they do. We're constantly trying to optimize. We're trying to get more efficient, more effective, more impactful, right? And so we really believe that in order to have that efficiency, you need a scaled and asynchronous collaboration capabilities. So here's some data that we took into account, some learnings that we've had through surveys, through usage, through a number of different research methodologies. So we said 68% of developers say they encounter a knowledge silo at least once a week. A knowledge silo meaning that there's knowledge out there that they can't find. They may not know what team has it, they may not know what person has it, and so they're in a silo, right? 75% said they need help on a weekly basis from people outside of their own teams, right? So that means I can't just ping, Sally or Joe, who I know. I've got to go play detective and figure out what team has it and what person within that team has it. We also learned that a key part of what technologists have to spend time doing is articulating their problem, right? This is a really interesting from a survey that we did that showed how many times, how often they have to iterate. So just articulating that problem, right? Just being able to frame your question correctly, just being able to actually be able to explain your problem to someone else so they can help you solve it actually takes quite a bit of time these days, right? And that's only made worse by the insane amount of information that's out on the internet. So you've got to get your question or your problem right, and then you've got to wade through all of the potential bits of information that you need. So what we also found through our surveys is that articulating that technical problem is actually a skill, and it takes experience in order to get better at articulating that problem. And I think what's also interesting is that you didn't see it really increase. So you saw the increase between 0 and 5 years. When you went up to 6 years and above, you saw an increase, right? So they feel more comfortable doing it. But what's interesting is you didn't see an increase after that. And I think that comes a lot from you're always learning new technologies. So you may be getting pretty good at framing a problem, but when you're dealing with a new technology or a new area, you're still learning that terminology and trying to frame your questions or frame your problems. And this is all before we get into actually finding what you need, right? Then it takes time to discover solutions, right? So what we found was that technologists 62% spent more than 30 minutes a day, right? So they spent more than 30 minutes a day, over half of them, searching for information, right? And as you can see there, you got about 25% are spending an hour or more. So people are spending a lot of time just trying to find knowledge that they need to help them solve the problems. So this is a big inefficiency, right? What we also found is that just not one resource is going to solve your problems, right? This isn't that surprising. What people are doing is they're actually using a lot of different resources. And this is from another set of research that we did. I think what's really interesting is that 42% said always. It always takes me more than one resource. So that may be written, that may be people, that may be technical documentation, who knows, right? And then when you add in the often, I think you get 77%. So 77%, 3/4, are always having to use multiple sources of information just to try and get the solution that they need. And then people have to glue it all together themselves. So first you got to articulate your problem. Then you got to go look for it and do lots of searches and lots of places. Then you've got to bring it, you've got to identify the right ones, and then you've got to glue it all together because not one resource is going to give you the answer the vast majority of the time. So another productivity hit that we see is that 52% of developers report waiting on answers to their questions. So when they can't find it asynchronously, when they can't find it on their own, they're sitting there. And I think we know what happens then, right? Okay, I can't work on this, so I'm gonna go find something else to work on, right? So I'm interrupting that brain flow. I have to dig into what I'm working on now, a new problem, a new, ticket or whatnot, and I'm digging into that, and I get into that, and then guess what? I get interrupted because I'm now getting the answer to the question I asked on the other problem that I was working on, and it really takes a productivity hit. And then, of course, just like we're all asking other people questions, we're also people who are helping give answers to others. So we're subject matter experts on some things, and we're asking other subject matter experts for that information. And so here you see almost 50% reported spending more than 30 minutes a day answering questions. And what we found, and I think if you look at the basis of what Stack Overflow is, technologists want to help other technologists. We actually do want to share our knowledge, right? We've all been in the place where we needed some key piece of information that somebody else had, right? And so we want to share our knowledge, but we want to do it in an efficient, effective, impactful way, not being interrupt-driven, right? And not answering the same question over and over and over again, right? And I think anybody who's worked in tech long enough can say, it's one of the things I asked, what's the top 3 questions you get asked most often? And wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to answer those ever again, if you could just point to a really well-written version of this answer and get people to start to leverage that, right? So 50%, so if you go back here, almost 50% are spending 30 or more minutes a day answering questions, and 50% are answering questions that they've asked before. That's some pretty big productivity hits that we're doing, and this is just the helping others. This isn't even solving their own problems. This is on top of helping others. So, the context switching, the waiting for answers, all the unnecessary friction are bigger than they need to be, right? So how can you measure the efficiency of how knowledge is leveraged in your organization, right, throughout that whole life cycle? Just like we think about like a technology life cycle, we have to think about a knowledge life cycle. And what we were really setting out to do was trying to figure out a way to like have a single metric that helps us say, is this life cycle working? Is it having the impact and efficiency that we're looking for? So we believe that knowledge reuse is a recycling process. Just like, the reason code repositories came to being for two reasons, folks, right? One, so that we didn't lose all the code that we had written, and two, so that we could share it with others and other people could leverage our code. Knowledge reuse is the same thing. All your knowledge is fantastic, but what we need to do is have a repository so that when people leave the organization, we don't freak out and go, hey, go do a brain dump for me, because we know how well that always works out, right? And secondly, we need to have a way that it can be leveraged and reused. And so we believe that knowledge reuse is about how you recycle that knowledge and how you scale your organization so people get consistent answers in an asynchronous that tries to limit disruption as much as possible. So we believe that the power of knowledge is measured by how many times it was useful to someone else, right? That's why Stack Overflow exists. Stack Overflow exists is because we can share knowledge that's useful to somebody else. Let's look at an example of that. So here's a question that was asked on our Stack Overflow almost 13 years ago. One question, one simple question. How do I undo the most recent local commits in Git, right? I think anybody who's ever worked with Git has probably come across that question. And it's not something you always remember all the time, right? So it's been, so it was asked, it's been edited 90 times, right? So the question has been edited 90 times. It's been upvoted nearly 24,000 times. It has 102 answers, because guess what? Different Git repositories get different versions, right? Getting better and better answers and everything. But the kicker, the real power of this, is it's been viewed 10.7 million times. So it's been used 10.7 million times. That may mean that 10.7 people used it, but I'm willing to bet it's not. I bet a lot of us have gone back over and over again because we can't quite remember at the time, nor should we have to. Our brain shouldn't be storing some of this smaller, repetitive sort of stuff. It should be focused on the bigger problems. And so here's a great example of how impactful knowledge reuse can be, right? How many people didn't go have to tap their colleagues on the shoulder or go ask somebody in a Slack or a Teams or whatever group what the answer to this was? So what's also interesting about knowledge reuse is not only do we have a question where maybe all of us have the same question, again, we actually have that same question. And here's an example. 62% of Stack Overflow users visited the same question multiple times in a 3-month period. So we can actually tell you all are coming back to the same question over and over again. And I think, like I said, that's okay. We're not expected to retain everything, and that's why we need knowledge to be shared. It isn't one and done. People are searching for the same thing a lot. So what does knowledge reuse mean, right? So it means reusing what others have already learned, what they've created, and what they've proved. And it saves us all time and money and productivity. And we all know that technologists want to be as productive as possible, right? So one, it helps minimize risk by making everyone having the same answer. You've all heard of like the telephone game where somebody gives an answer or a piece of information, you tell it down the line and how much it changes as it goes down the line. That's dangerous. The same thing happens in your organization if people are getting different, even if it's just slightly different answers and things are being done inconsistently across your organization. That can lead to bigger problems down the line. So one, you really reduce this risk by making standardized information. You have a source of truth, just like you have a source of truth in code or in data or databases and data warehouses, you have a source of truth for your knowledge. Secondly, you can increase the efficiency and effectiveness by reducing the repeat work, right? And reducing interruptions. So if I know where to go and I can get this information, not only am I not stuck waiting for someone to answer it, I'm not tapping somebody on the shoulder in reality or virtually to try and get this information from them. And last but not least is knowledge reuse scales over time, right? Just like open source or inner source in your organizations with code, once you start using it, other people start contributing to it, it scales its impact over time. So how do we decide to measure knowledge reuse? What we did is we looked at a session, a user session, and we said how many knowledge view events happen without in that same question them asking a new question, okay? So we said, let's say you come and you look at 3 pages and then you asked a question. We're gonna discount those 3 pages that you looked at, the three pieces of knowledge you looked at, because we're gonna assume you didn't get what you were looking for. You were hoping, but you didn't get there. However, if you looked at those and then you didn't ask a question, we're gonna count those reuse events. And let me tell you, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had about this over time, so let me tell you what we can and can't do. So what we decided is we can't measure whether a single piece of content answered their question or solved their problem, right? The only way to do that would be to get every user in Stack Overflow to click like, yes, this solved my problem, or no, it didn't, and that's not gonna happen, right? We all know that. Secondly, we know from our research that more often than not, you're gathering information from this. So again, not only can we not ask our users to tell us, did this solve your problem? We know it's highly likely that it was additive to their problem solving, but not one and done, unless maybe it was the get undo command. Maybe that solved their small problem. But what we can measure that users continue to visit and trust the information and the knowledge that is provided to them, right? If they keep coming back and looking at that piece of knowledge, if they keep coming back to the site, that's a good way to say it's still valuable, it's still relevant, it's still useful, right? So we look at knowledge reuse as on our Stack Overflow for teams, which is Stack Overflow for organizations, for technology organizations. And what we did is then we started to normalize it, because what we determined is that looking at it as an absolute number isn't all that useful, because the number of users grow. So the amount of knowledge grows and the amount of users can grow. And so how do you know whether you're actually being more efficient and more impactful? And also what we had is a lot of our organizations saying, well, how are we doing compared to others? Are we, just like, they want to know on their code commits and their deploys how they're doing to others, they want to know how they're doing in reusing their knowledge. So by being able to normalize it based on the number of users, then we can actually have cohorts so that they can compare themselves again and say, what's a good score? And where am I in the life cycle? So here's an example of how we measure knowledge reuse. So major software company, and we looked at knowledge reuse over on a month-by-month basis. So about 185,000 pieces of knowledge were reused. And I think, what we look for here is staying consistent, but ideally up and to the right, based on is new knowledge getting put in and are more users getting added, right? So this is how we think about knowledge reuse. This is how we share it with our customers and on our product. But this is the one I really care about, which is looking at it on a per user basis. So this is a different major software company, and getting started in their journey, and you can see that when you normalize it by the number of users, they're still growing. August, holidays, everybody's off. Our August numbers are always that way. But overall, you see that the knowledge reuse is going up when you're taking into account the number of users. So if users are growing, it doesn't automatically make you look like your people are being more efficient and more impactful. By normalizing it, it's really important. And then with that dotted line, we can then show them how they're doing compared to their cohorts, whether that's by size of team, by industry, by whether they're a fully distributed or hybrid team, and so we can share that with them. So in order to drive knowledge reuse, we think there's 4 really important steps that you have to follow. 1, you have to know your subject matter experts. 2, you have to make knowledge easy to capture and easy to scale. 3, discoverability and integrations are super important. And you have to make sure it's resilient. That 4th one I'm going to talk to you about, it is my personal pet project, having been in tech for 25 years. So number 1, empower your SMEs. There's a lot of SMEs you know in your organization, and there's many more you don't know. They may be a subject matter about a niche. They may be a subject matter that's well known in your organization, but it's important that you can identify them. Secondly, you need to recognize their contributions, because this is part of their job, right? This is how they deliver value to the organization. But last, and most importantly, you have to scale their expertise, right? You all know this. You have experts in your organization who's everybody's go-to for something, right? And everybody worries, what happens when that person leaves the organization? What are we gonna do, right? If they quit, right? And then, okay, then, so we worry about it. We don't do anything about it, but we worry about it. We talk about it when we're doing planning and all of that. And then they finally do leave. But part of the reason they leave is because they're burnt out, because they're answering the same questions over and over and over and over again. They're not getting time for their own development, their own growth, and they're not getting new opportunities because they're niched in there as the go-to person for X or Y or Z, right? And so what you really have to do is scale their expertise and make it so they're only answering new, interesting, innovative questions. And this way you can keep them around, you can let them keep growing, and you can let them actually develop their career and learn new things. You can tell I'm a little bit passionate about this, right? Documentation versus knowledge. So this is another pet peeve of mine, which is probably why I ended up at Stack Overflow. Documentation is the bane of every technologist's existence. It's the last thing we do. We put it off until the last minute. We are like, how much do I really have to do it? Maybe if I don't mention it and I put it off, I'll run out of time and they'll just let me get away without actually writing that documentation, right? We've tried all these things, right? It feels like a burden for the writers. But most importantly, it's written from an expert's point of view. So how reusable is it? If the person who built the technology is writing the documentation, how likely is it that someone who's new or touches it occasionally is going to come along and go, oh, I understand. Oh, here's what I needed. Great. And I'll go along and solve my problem, right? But it's also difficult to maintain and to navigate because you write 20-page long-form documents. How do I find the bits of information I need? And then how do I go in and update it to keep it up to date? So question and answers. Question and answer both are scalable, right? It's a short amount of investment of time from both the question asker and the answer. Secondly, people are actually, the builders and the SMEs are actually motivated to answer it because I know at least one person's going to read this, at least one person's going to use this, as opposed to me writing a 20-page document that I'm not sure anyone will ever spend more than 2 minutes reading, right? But secondly, because the user asked the question, the subject matter expert or the builder is more likely to write an answer that is more reusable because they're going to write it in the language that the question asker asked, as opposed into like their subject matter expert sort of language, right? And guess what? It's easier to update and validate. Instead of going in and saying, this 20-page document, is this still correct? People will be like, yeah, I'm not reading that. I didn't want to write it in the first place. Yep, it's up to date. But if I go in and say, here's this 2-paragraph answer, is this still correct? It's a lot easier for people to do that. Which leads me to the one that is, the last one is mine. So the third one that's most important is you don't have to know everything. Like I said, people go back to the same questions over and over and over again, but you have to know where to find it, right? There's a saying that says knowledge is power, but I think it's more important to say, knowledge is powerless if it can't be found. If it's written on some wiki, if it's written on something somewhere and no one can actually find it to actually leverage it, right? And so I love this quote, a person who can't find knowledge is no better off than a person who doesn't have access to it. So we need to make sure that the knowledge that we're capturing is accessible through integrations, through having a single source of information. So this is my pet peeve. So like I said, I've been in tech for 25 years and I think I've used every single possible platform for knowledge sharing, right? From when we used to take a flat file and use Perl, to a wiki, a homegrown wiki, to everything in between, right? And what I found is that most organizations had a 3 to 6 year life cycle on their knowledge sharing or knowledge management platform, because what happened is everybody gets excited, we're all going to use this, we're all going to put it in there, and then we don't update it. And then we sort of go about our business, and then people who need it come in and use it, and guess what? They get bad information. And what happens when they get bad information? They lose trust, so they stop going to it, right? And if they stop going to it, you just become this virtuous cycle where it eventually becomes a ghost town. It's like a library abandoned in time that was correct at some point in time in the past. You can't do that. And usually organizations then eventually, oops, sorry, I'm a hand talker and this mic is moving around on me. They eventually abandon it, right? And then you eventually get tired of it, and so they wait a year, and then they're like, okay, we have a new platform, and we're gonna start all over again. And then I know, because they ask us, and they say, can we import all of the knowledge from our old platform into our new platform? And you know what I say? No. Garbage out, garbage in. You're not going to start with out-of-date knowledge that's not there. And so I said before we'll ever consider allowing people to bring knowledge into our platform, we had to do content health. So the idea of content health is that we look at how often knowledge is actually getting viewed, how often it's coming up in search, how many views it's getting, and all of that. And we compare it with how long it's been since it's been edited. And so we make a prioritized list that say, if you come spend 10 minutes on our site, here's the most impactful pieces of content that we need you to review, and say, yes, good, like hitting the snooze button. 2, it needs some edits. Or 3, no, this actually isn't valid anymore at all. Let's archive it, and let's make sure it doesn't come up in search for users that need this anymore, right? So we did this. It's not hard. The algorithm is actually pretty simplistic in this. But guess what we found? Sustained for the first 3 months when we launched this, we saw 640% increase in edits on our content, right? So not only did we see that people actually want, like we said, people want to answer questions and they actually want to keep the knowledge up to date, but sometimes it can feel so overwhelming they don't even know where to start. And if you don't do this, just like you have tech debt, you end up with knowledge debt. And it's just as risky to your organization, that knowledge debt is, to your tech debt. And so you need to automate resiliency so that people are updating this constantly, so that people continue to trust it, they continue to invest it, and it has longer than that 3 to 6 year lifespan. So we believe that knowledge reuse is an important measure of collaboration and efficiency for teams. We believe that all learning starts with a question. And we believe that the collective you has all the answers that we need. Thank you.